Hello, welcome to our webinar today. I hope you are all able to hear me, and I just wanted to welcome you and get started here. Today we're going to be talking about designing academically rigorous service learning experiences, and this is part of our Generator School Network Professional Development Series, and we're really happy you could join us today. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Karen Pernew, the Program Director of the Institute for Service and Learning here at the National Youth Leadership Council. And I am here with Dr. Susan Root, the Research Director at NYLC, and Amanda Larson, who is the Program Coordinator here at NYLC. Amanda's providing us some technical support for today's webinar. And we just wanted to introduce ourselves.
Hi, everyone.
To get started here, I just wanted to find out where everyone is located here on the webinar. I am in St. Paul, Minnesota. Susan is joining us from Milwaukee, and we're interested to find out where you're from as well. If you want to explore some of the tools here, if you look in the middle of your screen under the dark square, there's a magic wand with a little sparkle at the edge. You can use that to point on the map where you're located so we can all get a sense of geographically where people are. Sure. Great. It looks like we have people from a wide variety of places, from the East Coast, quite a number from the Midwest. If anyone has questions as we're going through this, I'm fairly new to doing webinars myself, but please feel free to type your question into the text box and then hit send. You can send a question to the whole room, or you can send one just to one of the moderators, to Sue or I or Amanda, and we will answer your question as best as we can. We just want to find out a little bit more about you so that we know who you are in the room. If you could choose one of the options here for defining your role, and if you choose other, if you could type into the text box and let us know what your role is. Underneath the list of participants, you'll see some letter choices, A, B, C, D, and E, and we can get a sense of who people are in the room here. You can find the letters for the polling underneath the names under the participant list. There's some letters there. If you just want to type there rather than in the text box, just select one of those. So it looks like we have some service learning coordinators, community organization staff, and some other people, including higher education faculty and service learning. Good. And just one other quick question. We are interested in finding out what your experience is with service learning. If you could choose one of the letters here, we could take another quick poll and see, relatively speaking, how familiar you are with service learning. it looks like people are fairly new to service learning, but generally have some familiarity with it. So good, that's helpful. Thank you. Our agenda today, we are going to talk about a particular curriculum development method for designing service learning experiences for students that is based on state content standards and other kinds of content standards. We're going to talk about several familiar models of service learning. We're going to talk about designing the curriculum. We're going to look at understanding by design in service learning and give a rationale for using this method. And then we're going to take you step by step through some of the steps in backwards design for service learning units. One of the most familiar ways of thinking about service learning is the IPARDC model. I think most people are familiar about this. It is the cycle that we think of students going through when they do a service learning project, investigating community needs, planning and preparing what they're going to do for their service project, actually doing the service is the action part of it, reflecting on the service learning project throughout the cycle here, and then demonstrating and celebrating what they've done at the end of it. This is what we at NYLC like to think of typically as what students do as they go through the process. But because so many of the people that we work with are educators and teachers and are designing service learning projects, we've thought a little bit carefully about what it looks like from the teacher's perspective. And this is the service learning cycle that you'll find within the Generator School Network. And it talks about the various stages that teachers go through along with their students as they develop a service learning project, identifying the academic standards, the genuine needs, establishing evidence of learning, developing ownership, planning and preparing, all through the service aspect of it, and going into evaluating the experience in post-service. And what we're trying to do is work with a curriculum development method called Understanding by Design. It was created by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. And this is a pretty traditional way that teachers use to design curriculum within their classroom. It has 3 stages: identifying the desired results of instruction, determining acceptable evidence of learning, and planning learning activities.
And now,
Sue Root here.
Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, go ahead, Sue. I was just going to introduce you.
Oh, go ahead, Sue. I was just going to introduce you, talking about the rationale behind this method.
So what we're going to do today is, I hope everybody can hear me okay, we want to talk about the rationale for actually using understanding by design with service learning. And then we want to walk through actually the first step in the process of understanding by design, or backward planning, which is identifying desired results. So the rationale in the United States, academic achievement we know equates with mastery of content standards. Most people would make this equation, but in understanding by design, mastery really goes farther. In Wiggins and McTighe's view, mastery equals understanding, which is ability to use knowledge and skills with flexibility and insight. So I'm not sure what's going on with the feedback, but I think we'll just try to walk through this as well as we can and hopefully adjust for the problems. So in Wiggins and McTighe's work, students can be said to really understand standards and benchmarks when they can explain a standard, and that is when they can give accurate, complete explanations of concepts and so on. They really understand when they can interpret, when they can make meaning from various accounts of concepts, like texts, graphic displays, charts, and so on. They understand when they can apply what they've learned, when they can use or adapt what they've learned in a novel situation, not just in a problem that resembles one that they've encountered before, but in a novel situation. And then finally, in Wiggins and McTighe's work, understanding is also indicated when students show perspective, when they understand other people's point of view, when they show empathy, and also self-knowledge. So what do we know about the impacts of service learning on understanding content standards? Well, findings from research on the impacts of service learning on mastery of academic outcomes, specifically scores on state assessment tests, are mixed. Some studies show impacts for service learning on scores on state assessments for some grade levels and also for some subject areas, but the results are mixed. There are a number of explanations that people in the service learning field have given for why we don't see more positive results on student scores on state assessments. And one explanation is that state assessments are poorly matched to the types of learning that are produced by service learning. So this explanation says basically state assessments focus on cognitive tasks like recall, and where in service learning what we really try to do is impact higher order thinking, problem solving, and so on. Another explanation is that many service learning projects are of low quality. They don't link to content standards. For example, the food drive that doesn't really connect to any kind of academic outcomes. The final possible explanation, and the one that we've been working with, centers around the process of instructional design of service learning. And specifically, we think that the way in which service learning projects are planned may really limit students' opportunities to access and explore academic content during a project. So in planning service learning, when you look at guides for service learning planning, typically the process that teachers are walked through is to have students choose a problem of concern to them, a community problem or a school problem of concern that's chosen as the organizing center for the learning experience. Then second, students and teachers investigate the problem and identify and design a service project that will address it. And then finally, in many guides, teachers are told at this point, then go ahead and identify the standards and benchmarks that you think will be addressed as students plan and carry out the service learning project. We think that as a result of that, students learn from service learning, but their learning may be local and specific. They may, for example, gain knowledge about the specific community problem. They probably gain knowledge about their service activity and the context. But what's a concern about that process is that students may not gain the more general, abstract concepts and skills that are embedded in the content standards. In addition, we think that this process allows a lot of variation between students in your classroom in whether they encounter standards-based ideas. So whether they encounter standards-based ideas will probably depend on how their specific project unfolds, their role in it, whether they're asked to be, say, a researcher or somebody who gets in touch with community agencies, and then finally their personal motivation to explore academic resources. What we think is that by using understanding by design, we can increase students' access to content in service learning projects. in understanding by design, which is probably familiar to most of you. We use backward planning to design instruction. We begin with the goals of instruction, not the learning activities themselves. So in service learning, learning goals are identified first before students choose a specific community problem, the service activity that they will do, and so on. So that's those academic outcomes, or those outcomes that we want to see in students at the end of the project, are identified first, and then they go about choosing the specific community problem and the service activity. So the stage that we're primarily going to talk about today, because of time limitations, is identifying the desired results of instruction. There are 5 steps in this phase. First of all, you identify a topic for your service learning unit. Then secondly, identify the content standards and benchmarks that you want to target. Then third, construct 1 to 3 big ideas, overarching ideas that can encompass multiple standards and benchmarks that you've chosen. You rewrite these big ideas as essential questions that will guide students' discovery or inquiry during their service learning project. And finally, you unpack big ideas and content standards and benchmarks into specific learning targets, knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So just let's talk about the first step in identifying desired results for service learning, and that's identifying a topic for the service learning unit. We think that in order to keep the focus on content, the topic for the service learning project should be drawn from your subject area. So just as a couple of examples, in science, you might choose the topic, impacts humans have on the environment. In social studies, you might choose a topic such as the nature of democratic citizenship. In health, food, physical education, maybe food decision making. So what we want to do, since we don't have time to work through these activities with you today, is to give you a process you can use at each step of the way. So the process for identifying topics is to take a look at major ideas in your subject area, and these can be headings from curriculum frameworks, key standards, possibly power standards, chapter headings, and textbooks. You would review those, and then you would identify 1 to 3 topics from these resources, areas that you're supposed to address in your grade level and subject area, for which you think service learning would be an effective approach for building understanding of that topic. So what we want to find out now is if you have any questions, if you're confused, anything that you want to ask about this, what we've talked about so far, this step of identifying topics for service learning projects. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody that seems to be having problems, so I think we're okay to go on. Okay, so I think let's go ahead and go on. I can turn this a little bit.
Yeah, we may have lost Sue for a moment here. So she wanted to talk about identifying content standards and benchmarks. And so in this step, this is really a complex process because service learning has dual purposes. We want to make learning meaningful by providing children and students the opportunities to gain and apply their skills that they learn in school in a real-world context. And the other purpose is to help students meet citizenship or character education goals of schooling.
So now what we want to do is go ahead and talk about the second step in identifying desired results for a backward planning-based service learning project. And this is to identify the content standards and benchmarks that you're going to target in your project. I think this is a complex process in service learning, in particular because service learning has dual purposes. The first purpose of it is to make learning meaningful, by providing students with opportunities to gain and apply academic learning in a real-world context. But the second purpose, the reason that we do service learning, is to help students meet the citizenship character education goals of service learning, or of schooling. Most of us, when we do service learning, have these two purposes in mind. What that means, I apologize for coughing. What that means is that when you identify standards and benchmarks for a service learning unit, you need to draw from two areas. You need to draw from the curriculum framework for the academic area for the project. And then secondly, you need to draw from civic character education goal statements. That would include district school goals for character development, ethics for a subject area, and we've given you one example there, the civic mission of schools goals. The civic mission of schools was a major report in civic education that was developed a few years ago, and this list shows you goals, they think goals for civic education.
We should be sending that out to you in just a second here, the Civic Mission of Schools document.
So these are the two types of sets of standards that you would be drawing on. Now, what we want to do is walk you through a couple of examples of plans that have done this. For example, for a unit that was centered around the topic impacts humans have on the environment, you might choose the academic standards from environmental science. Say natural systems have many parts that interact to maintain a living system. Humans change environments in ways that can be beneficial or harmful to themselves and other organisms. And then a process standard in environmental science, students will investigate and analyze environmental issues. And then the civic character education goals we would address in this unit would be students will take individual and collective action toward addressing environmental challenges. Another example from math, economics, and health education, academic standards from math would be, say, students, and the topic for this unit would be food decisions and food miles. So, for example, a math standard that students would be addressing would be to use proportional reasoning to solve problems involving ratios. And they would use that because they would be comparing food miles and their impacts. And then an economic standard explain how societies and nations attempt to satisfy their basic needs and wants by utilizing scarce capital, natural and human resources. And then a couple of character standards from health education. Understand the impacts of their own and others' health choices. Encourage peers to make positive health choices. So So what we'd like to have you think about for a process for that identifying standard step is what standards from your academic area would you review and use and draw on, and then possibly what civic character goals, for example, do you have some for your district or school? What about the civic mission of schools goals? Could you see yourself using those? So your process would be reviewing those two types of standards and pulling from them. So the next step then in identifying desired results is to construct the big ideas. Big ideas are 1 to 3 overarching ideas that students should retain after instruction ends. Wiggins and McTighe developed the idea of constructing big ideas as a way really to avoid the problem of proliferation of state standards and benchmarks. Many states have more standards and benchmarks than teachers can possibly address in 180 days of school. So the idea behind big ideas is that these are really essential ideas within disciplines that are important for students to learn and that can encompass multiple standards and benchmarks. So what we mean by big ideas are they're ideas that represent the heart of a discipline. They recur across grade levels. I think that one example of that would be the scientific method. Comes up across grade levels in science. Big ideas have value and use beyond the classroom. They're things that we hope students will be able to use in their present life and in the future. And then finally, they are more general than specific facts, concepts, and skills, but really provide a kind of anchor or glue for those. So examples of big ideas, core concepts in a field are one type of big idea. For example, the concept of natural selection in biology. Themes are another type of big ideas. For example, fairy tales around the world. Issues or debatable topics in a field are another example of what can constitute big ideas. Like, for example, rights versus responsibilities of democratic citizens. A problem or a paradox in a field can also constitute another type of big idea, like pollution, for example, in environmental science. And then finally, in organizing theory. For example, in child development, Erickson's theory is an organizing theory. Macroeconomics is an organizing theory in economics. So what we think when you are constructing big ideas in service learning is that you ought to have big ideas that represent the dual purposes of service learning. That is, the big ideas that you construct ought to represent both subject area standards and civic character education goals for your unit. Okay. So for example, if we take those types that we just talked about, big ideas in service learning, concepts might be things like ecosystem, democracy's need for active citizens, factors that influence health choices. Themes might be the story of a wetlands. Issues or debatable topics are especially fertile ground for service learning big ideas. So an issue such as meeting economic needs of a society versus conserving the environment, which is more important? Who is responsible for our health choices? Is it us? Is it our society? Is it some mix? And then finally, problems or paradoxes. Pollution might be a good big idea for a service learning environmental project and so on. Okay, let's go ahead. So again, we're trying to give you a process or a tool for writing these big ideas. So at this point, you would have identified the topic for your service learning project. you would have identified your standards and benchmarks, both academic and from civic character education frameworks. Then what you do at this step is to review your standards and benchmarks, which can be clustered together. And ideally, it might be possible for you in some cases to link together big ideas from your academic area with big ideas from character civic education, the big ideas in character civic education you're trying to address. Then you write a big idea, a concept, theme, or issue that captures each cluster. Once you've done that, you can work alone or with other people to review your big ideas and ask yourself, are these central ideas in one or more subject areas? Are they ideas that you want students to retain long after the unit ends? Are they useful ideas for life outside of school? Are they guiding concepts that you really would like to see students be able to use in the real world?
How is everybody doing here? Any questions on writing big ideas or looking at some of the content standards? Is everybody understanding?
We again want to know, do you have questions or confusion at any point here, either about identifying standards or about writing big ideas for service learning projects?
I'm just going to skip this. The next thing you do after writing the big ideas.
Okay, so now we're going to move, and Karen is going to be talking with you about the process of developing essential questions.
Essential questions are the next step when you're identifying the desired results of instruction using understanding by design. And I think the essential questions are particularly relevant for service learning in a way. You base these off the big ideas that you've come up with. What are those broad conceptual frameworks, the things that you really want students to remember and understand? And then you reframe them as questions. These can be posed as ongoing dilemmas or problems in a discipline or in life. They're meant to stimulate student inquiry and give young people a reason to master the academic outcomes. It's a way of really connecting the knowledge that you want students to retain from this with things that are going to spark their curiosity as much as possible and give them the reasons to know, suggest the learning activities that are going to take place throughout the unit, and find ways that will enable students to answer the questions. Here's some examples of essential questions that have been used in service learning projects, looking at how does culture affect how people view natural resources? What's the difference between developing natural resources and depleting natural resources? In what ways should government regulate their use? Looking at some of those kind of big questions that don't have right or wrong answers like that is a way of engaging students into the content areas that you really want to study, while at the same time really giving them something that they can sink their teeth into. What makes a diet healthy or unhealthy? What influences how you choose and which foods to purchase? Really looking at things in their larger cultural context can help you bring several different academic disciplines together. And that's what these essential questions try to do, along with the big ideas, is really bridge the disciplines, bridge the ethical and character development and citizenship development that you want students to get at. Other questions, for example, for some younger students, or even older students, is punctuation necessary? What is a true friend? Some of these questions that you can explore both through service learning and in the content of your core academic courses are questions. Somebody asked, do you want students to come up with these questions? And these are things that the teacher or the educator generally comes up with to kind of guide student exploration. You want students to kind of use the knowledge and skills that they're gaining through the experience in order to answer the questions. But these are also things that students can devise as they enter their service learning experiences with this. You would want, you might ask students to write some questions about what they're learning and things that they want to explore. But I think if you really start with the content standards, these are things that you can use to guide the instruction in there. That's a really good question. A little bit about the process of writing questions for students, the essential questions. The place to begin is really revisiting the big ideas and the content standards that you want students to address, and framing the questions for students to answer. You want to make the questions intriguing and accessible for students, not necessarily something that you would be asking in an academic context necessarily, but really frame them in kid language and try to make them something that's going to be really accessible. Another good way to frame these is to try to create sets of interrelated questions that get at the various kinds of content standards that you want to address in a service learning unit. Because you are bridging several disciplines, several academic disciplines, and several different kinds of skills, coming up with a set of related questions can help you bridge those in your learning activities. And then you also want to review the questions that you've written to make sure that they link to prior knowledge and require core content that you're teaching in the lessons that you do.
Do we have anybody that has any questions? About this step of writing essential questions? Okay, if not, then I think we'll go ahead and talk about the last step in identifying desired results. And this is a critical step in terms of mastery of content standards. And this step involves unpacking the outcomes you've identified for your service learning project into learning targets. Learning targets are more specific than big ideas or content standards and benchmarks. They refer to two types of things: specific knowledge, skills, and attitudes that will be essential for students to demonstrate proficiency on standards. And then secondly, they refer to what you think students will have to know, be able to do, and believe in order to gain real understanding of the big ideas for your unit. When we talk about learning targets, there are really three types that we can talk about that apply to service learning. First, our knowledge. That's concepts and relations among concepts. So ideas that are represented primarily by nouns or noun phrases would be knowledge learning targets. And you can go through, think about going through the standards and benchmarks for your project and also the big ideas and looking at nouns and noun phrases that you think represent knowledge outcomes. Yeah, after this. Skills refer to thinking skills and motor skills. And I think the most important type of skill are going to be thinking skills in a service learning project, and that is activities such as analysis, synthesis, problem solving, critical thinking, and so on. And then a final type of outcome which is important in a service learning project are desired beliefs and values. And those include things like motivation to learn, engagement in school, interest in the subject area, valuing your subject area, as well as a commitment, a belief in the importance of being an active citizenship, a belief that one has a responsibility to care about and take care of society and community and care for other people. So again, we want to try to give you a tool here that you can use later to unpack learning targets. So what you would be doing at this step is, first of all, reviewing the big ideas for your service learning unit, as well as the academic and civic character standards and benchmarks you've identified for the unit. And then you would be going through those statements and identifying the specific knowledge, skills, and attitude outcomes that seem to be embedded in those standards and benchmark statements. Then, and I included a table there that you might think about using as a tool when you're unpacking specific knowledge, skills, and attitude outcomes. Then I think what you want to do as the last step is really highlight those learning targets that are the most essential by asking what state and district assessments will require your students to know, be able to do, and display out of the standards and benchmarks and big ideas. And then, are there other outcomes, knowledge, skills, and attitude outcomes that are critical for students to show understanding of the big ideas and be able to answer the essential questions? And when we talk about understanding in this part, we're talking about understanding in the way that Wiggins and McTighe talked about it. So are there other outcomes that are critical for students to demonstrate, to be able to explain, to be able to interpret, to be able to apply, that will really be critical for your students to do those things? Okay, any questions that we have so far about unpacking this final step of unpacking the learning targets? Okay, so then our next steps in backward planning of service learning, and we hope to be able to work with schools and districts in the future on these steps as well, is you would determine acceptable evidence of learning. That is, once you have your desired results, you need to figure out what tasks and what criteria for success will count as acceptable evidence that students have mastered the essential understandings for your service learning unit. And then the third step, and this step you only go to after you've identified the goals for the project, determine what will count as acceptable evidence, then you go ahead and plan the learning activities in your service learning unit using the IPART-C model.
A few moments ago, we distributed to you through the web interface here a couple of documents, and I just wanted to mention them to you. I'm not going to go through them at this point, but if you have any questions about them, please feel free to ask. The first one is a sample literacy unit involving service learning that was developed using this method. It was developed in North Carolina over the course of this summer. And that is something that will give you a sense of the full development of what this looks like, an overview of it. It doesn't include all of the individual lesson plans that the teachers developed, but it includes the full overview looking at all of the planning that went in, the topic, the content standards, the big ideas, the essential questions, and the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that this teacher wanted the students to develop in this project. It also goes through the assessment, looking very carefully at how student learning is going to be assessed in this unit. And then it outlines the plan for the service learning portion of it, as well as some of the other lessons that need to be given in order for students to have the background knowledge and skills that are necessary to carry out the service part of the project. So you can take a look at that. If you have any questions now, you can ask. If you have questions later, you can certainly ask by email or within the Generator School Network as well. The second document that you received is a blank planning template for doing this kind of planning, and that's something that you can use as you develop your own service learning projects, really closely tied to the academic content standards. If anybody has any questions, please ask at this point. We would love to hear from you. Yeah.
So I would just like to mention one point. We've been working with this approach to design. It does differ in some ways from what sort of traditional ways of talking about service learning planning, but that really has been intentional. What we are doing is saying that teachers' primary responsibility is to generate academic learning in students, and so we really think that the process of identifying academic goals and working toward those goals has to be kind of the umbrella framework for service learning projects, just as it is for other types of learning experiences. Okay, I think that...
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll be sending out the PowerPoint by email. It will also be available on the Generator School Network. There is a topic area called Creating Academically Rigorous Service Learning Projects, and we will post the materials from this webinar on there as well. We really thank you for attending, and please feel free to get in touch with us if you have any questions or any specific feedback. And apologies about the technical difficulties with this, and thank you for bearing with us.